Well, a very big thank you. That was what David Cameron had to say to British troops in Afghanistan as he used Armed Forces Day to drop in on them. The UK officially pulls out of the country next year, but the prospect of a lasting peace remains elusive. Indeed, the Prime Minister agreed with a senior British commander's assessment today that the West missed an opportunity to talk to the Taliban more than a decade ago. Fatima Manji reports.
It was a surprise visit, but perhaps not entirely unpredictable, on a day declared to celebrate the role of the armed forces. There is very little to celebrate in Afghanistan, however. More than a decade on from when British troops first arrived, the violence has not let up, and the Taliban remain strong. But as he met and dined with soldiers in Helmand province, the Prime Minister maintained they would be coming home by 2014, and that the peace process must be Afghan-led. That process, however, depends on talks with the Taliban, and that's already faced a few teething problems. Last week, the Afghan government was furious as the Taliban launched its own embassy, flag and all, in Doha. And today, a top British commander in Afghanistan said talks with the Taliban should have begun a decade ago. Lieutenant General Nick Carter told The Guardian newspaper,
"Back in 2002, the Taliban were on the run. I think at that stage, if we had been very prescient, we might have spotted a final political solution, getting all Afghans to sit at the table and talk about their future."
Well, I think you can argue about whether the settlement we put in place after 2001 could have been better arranged. Of course you can make that argument. Since I became Prime Minister in 2010, I've been pushing all of the time for a political process, and that political process is now underway. But at the same time, I know you can't bank on that, which is why we've built up the Afghan army, built up the Afghan police, supported the Afghan government. So after our troops have left, and they will be leaving under the programme we've set out, after our troops have left, this country shouldn't be a haven for terrorists.
The terror continues. Just days ago, there was an attack near the presidential palace in Kabul. But meeting David Cameron today, the Afghan president insisted it would not stop efforts for peace.
We've had them killing the Afghan people, but we still ask for peace. This was peanuts, comparatively speaking. Quite an irrelevant attack. We're more concerned when they attack the Afghan civilians. We're more concerned when they attack Afghan schools and children.
David Cameron also got a chance to examine military equipment, including this surveillance drone, a topic causing controversy both here and in neighbouring Pakistan, where he headed next. And as he meets Pakistani President Zardari, no doubt a key concern for Cameron is whether his allies in the region will be reliable enough to help bring about a political settlement.
Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Rudra Chowdhury, who last year met 4 Taliban representatives to discuss, amongst other things, their attitude to peace talks. I began by asking him if the Taliban were capable of compromise.
You have one brand of the Taliban negotiating in Doha and elsewhere, but at the same time making clear to their cadre that, look, the fight is still on. I mean, much like sort of Western forces or British forces, the Taliban too have a cadre and a constituency that they have to appease. So this cannot be seen as a signal of defeat or surrender.
You've spoken to former Taliban members. How possible is compromise, given that these are extremists, and you could say, well, compromise just isn't in their DNA?
I think compromise is possible. I think the Taliban have realized, much like Western forces, that there is no military victory to this fight, that they cannot militarily take Afghanistan back. They are on the back foot as far as the military operations are concerned. And there is a realization that Afghanistan today is a very different country to what it was even a dozen years ago. The Taliban have an audience of their own. In many ways, negotiations is a bit like a public relations exercise. It's a bit of a dance which they have to keep appeased their own constituencies. So much like Western forces have to keep their publics sort of appeased when it comes to talks with extremists, as you say, or with the Taliban, which is a very hard thing to do for David Cameron or President Barack Obama. Similarly, it is incumbent upon the Taliban leadership to demonstrate to their cadre that, look, we haven't lost the fight. The fact that we're in Doha doesn't mean that we've surrendered.
The top British commander in Afghanistan has said that the West could have talked to the Taliban 2002 and actually got somewhere.
I think it is extremely significant that General Nick Carter has made this statement. And I think it needs to be read in the spirit of admission by the military command by the highest British military commander in Afghanistan that talks are a good thing and talks are okay. Now, if you look at Nick Carter's own statement that he made to The Guardian, he caveats it himself and says, look, it's much easier to make easy comments on hindsight, right? But having said that, in 2001 and 2002, the political climate simply did not exist for negotiations.
When you were talking to these former Taliban members, did you see in front of you fanatics, or did you see some reasonable men?
There's no doubt about the fact that when you talk to so-called extremists, you do legitimize their stance. There's no way of getting around that.
Well, what were they like, though, to talk to?
Not very different from talking to many others in the business of conflict. Deep personal histories. Most of our interviews started with allowing them to talk about themselves. Spend a couple of hours telling us who you are, where you come from, about your family life. Why did you join the Taliban movement in the first place? A lot of those narratives are fairly compelling.